Welcome everyone to this conference of Judaism Science and Medicine Group on the topic Judaism and Public Health, Living in the Shadows of Pandemics. I'm Chavati Rosh Samuelson. I'm a Regents Professor of History, Irving and Miriam Lowe Professor of Modern Judaism, and Director of Jewish Studies at Arizona State University in Tempe, Arizona. The Judaism Science and Medicine Group, or JSMG for short, is an international society that was founded in 2008 to promote constructive relations between Judaism and the sciences, with special attention to medicine, the domain where the interface between Judaism and the sciences is most evident. JSMG consists of Judaica scholars, scientists, physicians, health professionals, rabbis, and educators. The society is distinctly pluralistic, including people from across the denominational spectrum of modern Judaism. And the scholarship it features is distinctly interdisciplinary or even transdisciplinary, covering many academic disciplines in the natural sciences, the social sciences, and the humanities. The primary activity of JSMG is an annual conference, and each year we have chosen to focus on a different theme. Last year, we devoted JSMG conference to Judaism and climate change. And like this conference, it was held on Zoom. And in 2020, just days before the COVID-19 pandemic started, the JSMG conference, which was held in person, focused on Jewish healing through the ages. And Noah Efron actually was our keynote speaker. Over the past decades, the conferences of JSMG engaged topics such as disability, obesity, sexuality, mental health, and other topics. Our conferences are open to the public, and they are meant to bridge the gap between the academy and the society at large. This year's conference focuses on Judaism and public health for obvious reasons. The COVID-19 pandemic has upended the life of all people worldwide, and it is not over yet. We are now facing the rise of yet another subvariant of Omicron, whether it's BA2 or BA3, I'm not sure, and surges are experienced in Europe, China, and other places. The causes of the pandemic, the official responses, the mitigating practices, the scientific achievements, and the social and cultural impact are still disputed, and it may be too soon to draw definitive lessons. Yet, the COVID-19 pandemic is neither the first nor the last, because throughout history, humanity has lived with pandemics, and pandemics will be with us in the future. The purpose of this conference is to engage the experience of living in the shadows of pandemics from scientific, medical, historical, sociological, religious, legal, and ethical perspectives. Hopefully, this conference will enable us to deepen our understanding of pandemics in human history and in Jewish history, so that we will be able to face them better in the future. A lot of people have made this conference possible. I want to thank the presenters and the chairs of the sessions for taking time from their very busy schedules to contribute their knowledge and their expertise. We are here to learn from all of you, from each other, and from the people who are joining us on Zoom from various places in the United States and abroad. I want to particularly thank the staff of the Center for Jewish Studies, Lisa Kaplan and Dawn Beeson, for doing all the logistics for the conference. For the past 2 years, the Center for Jewish Studies has offered many virtual public programs, including the conference, this conference, and that has required an immense amount of work. So now please join me in thanking Lisa Kaplan and Dawn Beeson for their excellent and dedicated work that has made this conference possible. And I would like to invite Dean Jeffrey Cohen, the Dean of Humanities at ASU, to welcome all of you on behalf of ASU. Dean Cohen, please.
Thanks, Hava. I have to say this is my 4th year now as Dean of Humanities at ASU, and I've come to look forward to this annual conference like no other event that we have. I learned so much from it. Must admit, I do really love it when it's face-to-face and get to interact with people, but I recognize too that by going virtual, it's been able to reach much wider audiences. Anyway, this conference seems to me, it seems like every year it attains what we're all about here at ASU Humanities, that is to offer international models for how to investigate some of the most important and pressing issues of our time and to do them in a transdisciplinary way. The Jewish Studies program is part of the Humanities Division of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences here at ASU. It's a university based on inclusion and public outreach. I always think of the program as being a jewel in the crown of our humanities array here. We have 3 large interdisciplinary schools, 14 centers and initiatives. ASU is unique in its attention to how science and religion can and should work together to address issues of utmost concern, from climate change to pandemics. We'll never be able to address them with any efficacy unless we use every mode that we have and think through with as many colleagues as possible how to do it. JSMG demonstrates how Jewish studies is an essential contributor to these conversations. And finally, one thing that I'll offer is it strikes me that this year's theme, Judaism and public health, living in the shadows of pandemics, couldn't be more timely. We're far from out of the COVID-19 pandemic. We have much to learn about caring for communities and for ourselves as we move forward, and much too to relearn that we've known from history, because living in pandemics has been a human constant. So I just want to close by thanking Chava. Thank you so much for everyone who's come here today. I hope everyone stays safe and healthy, and I thank you for joining us.
Great, thank you, Dean Cohen. And we're going to open this conference with the Michael Anbar Memorial Keynote Lecture in Judaism, Science, and Medicine. The keynote address has been funded by special gift from the Anbar family in memory of Dr. Michael Anbar, a scientist, medical researcher, scholar of Judaism, and lover of art, literature, and music. We are very grateful for the generosity of the Anbar family. And I invite Dr. Joshua Anbar, who is an adjunct lecturer in the College of Health Solutions of ASU, to say a few words on behalf of the Anbar family. Joshua, please.
Thank you very, very much, Chava. Good morning. May you live in interesting times. This apocryphal Chinese saying was one of my Saba's, Dr. Michael Anbar's, favorite sayings. While originally intended as a curse by implying that times of tranquility were better than the chaos of more interesting times, my Saba loved the interesting times. It was interesting times that beget interesting conversations, and interesting conversations are what he lived for. Rarely in any of our conversations did we stay with the initial topic of our debate, and we would explore a vast array of fields, from science to history, to literature, to political science, and of course, Judaism. The last 2 years have been very interesting, to say the least. As a society, we have faced challenges and been called on to make sacrifices that have been without precedent in the post-war era. While my Saba is no longer with us in the physical realm, I have no doubt that he would have many thoughts to share on the sacrifices, decisions, and policies we have employed to battle the most significant pandemic since the Spanish flu. As a scientist, I have no doubt that he would have eagerly embraced the COVID-19 vaccine and been one of the first in line to receive it. As an arch conservative with libertarian leanings, I also have no doubt that he would have strongly opposed various mandates, whether they be mask wearing, vaccination requirements, or school closures. I also know that as a Jew, he would have reflexively wrestled with these challenges and looked towards Jewish philosophy and our theological traditions to better understand what our moral obligations are in these unprecedented times. As I was preparing this introduction, I could not help but think of the running debates my Saba and I had about abortion. While opinions about abortion are highly politicized, our conversations around abortion centered on the concept of when does life begin. As a scientist, my Saba believed that life began at conception, since this is when the fertilized egg became genetically distinct from everything around it. Early on, I would criticize this position, since it did not consider viability, and we would discuss what it means for a nascent fetus to become viable. Neither of us came up with an answer that the other would accept. As our conversation went on, we turned to Judaism to find an answer. As with most things, the Jewish tradition did not have a ready response. On the one hand, the Talmud is clear that once the greater part of a child's head is delivered, life is believed to have begun. The Torah, however, implies that once a fetus is sufficiently formed, then it is considered a person, especially when considering challenges arising from capital crimes such as murder. While we never settled our debate about the permissibility of abortion, my Saba was deeply moved by what our theological tradition seemed to say about life, its importance, its beginning, and its end. In terms of COVID-19, I am quite confident that we would have had similar conversations about the benefits of various policies embraced and decisions made to battle the pandemic. Initially, we would have started our debate at the science and about how dangerous the SARS-CoV-2 virus actually is. We would have then drifted into the politics driving decision-making and whether sacrificing individual liberties in a time of unprecedented crises was worth the cost that would be inflicted on society. We would then proceed to talk about concepts of pikuach nefesh and lador vador, and our obligation to our society, both in the here and now, as well as in the future. As a public health practitioner, I would have defended school closures to ensure the safety of all members of society, while as an educator, my Saba would have defended the need to ensure the development of our youth and the success of the next generation. We both would have embraced aspects of our shared Jewish tradition. We may never have agreed on all of the details of the challenges we faced because of COVID-19. I know that we would have been better off for having these interesting conversations. His ideas would have informed my ideas, and the opposite would be true as well. Eventually, we would have arrived at a middle ground that would shape our future conversation on what appropriate mitigation efforts would look like and how we should transition out of our pandemic stance as we learn to live with a new endemic disease. This would not be possible without the interesting conversations that would meld together science, policy, and Judaism. I look forward to the interesting conversations that will be sparked from the lectures we hear today, and in the finest tradition of my Saba, may we continue to live in interesting times. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Very apt introduction and really outlined some of the challenges that are facing us today. So I'm now inviting Dr. Noah Efron of Ilan University to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Paul Wolpe of Emory University. And Dr. Efron will also manage the Q&A and will also respond to Dr. Wolpe. So Noah, the screen is yours.
Wonderful. Well, it's a pleasure and an honor to return to Arizona, even virtually, as Arizona is the world's most important center for the study of Judaism and medicine and science. I brought my name tag from the last time, which was also the last in-person conference I was ever in, just days before the pandemic spread across the world. So thank you, Chava, for this conference and for the astonishing thing that you have built here. It is beautifully fitting that this conference begin with Professor Paul Root Wolpe. Paul Root Wolpe holds the Raymond Shinazi Distinguished Research Chair in Jewish Bioethics at Emory University, where he is the director of the Emory Center for Ethics. He holds appointments in the Emory University School of Medicine, the Graduate Department of Religion, and the Department of Sociology. And if that does not already give you a vivid picture of the remarkable reach of this remarkable scholar, consider too that Paul Root Wolpe was for 15 years senior bioethicist for the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA. He's also the editor-in-chief of the prestigious American Journal of Bioethics Neuroscience. He is the president of the Association of Bioethics Program Directors, a past president of the American Society for Bioethics and Humanities, a fellow of the College of Physicians of Philadelphia, the country's oldest medical society, and a fellow of the Hastings Center, the oldest bioethics Institute in America. He also served as the first national bioethics advisor to Planned Parenthood Federation of America. Paul Root Wolpe has advised presidential committees on bioethics. He has advised DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, on the ethics of neuroscience. He has helped professional associations like the American Psychological Association develop their ethics procedures. He has advised universities and corporations and foundations and NGOs. And there is much, much more to say, but I know that those of you who really want a true measure of Professor Paul Root Wolpe will, excuse me, I'm sharing screen, who want the true measure will want for me to consult, I think, that most ancient and venerable of exact sciences, gematria, or Hebrew numerology, which identifies the true essences of matters by finding exact correlations between numerical values of matters under investigation, in this case, Professor Wolpe, and their essential characteristics. So, so turning straight to it, if we take the name Paul Root Wolpe, then we see that it has a numerical value of 463, and this astonished me when it jumped out from the pages. I'm sure it has for you, that is the precise numerical value of the words Gaon, Noaz, Bal Chazon, Ben Adam, a bold genius, visionary, and mensch, which Professor Wolpe is. And it's also, as you might have seen, the precise numerical value of chips and beer, of fries and beer, which I think is an indication of his human, the fact that he's such a man of the people, despite all his achievements, his genuineness and decency and humanity. So having looked at all that, I will just end by, wait 1 second. Sorry. I will just end by saying that one of the greatest challenges of our age of scientific miracles and technological wonders, and the opportunities and the dangers that these miracles and wonders have brought with them, is who can speak with wisdom about these things, about the cosmos above, about our genes within, about Prozac and about chimeras, about climate change and gender reassignment, about Tinder and Grindr and nuclear power and vaccinations and genetic enhancement and doping, and the endless series of existential questions, the answers to which are going to decide whether our children's children thrive or fail to thrive. Who can speak to these things? Not the brilliant scientists and technologists whose job it is to create these new capacities, not the politicians who support and regulate these capacities, but who lack scientific and technological expertise to fully grasp them or the opportunities and dangers they create. The answer is Paul Root Wolpe and the very, very, very small handful of people like him who bring an exquisite understanding of science, medicine, technology, philosophy, history, psychology, theology, and more. They are guides. They are the guides without whom we would be stumbling in the darkness. What an honor it is to introduce you, Paul, to get this conference underway.
Wow, I'm kind of bowled over by that particular introduction. So thank you so much, Noah. Thank you, Chava, for the invitation. Thank you, Lisa, for your help. And I want to start by saying a little bit about how I work, because Noah and I had to negotiate it. And that is, I wish that I was the kind of academic who wrote long prose papers weeks before a presentation and could send them out, but that's not how I work. Chava asked me to speak on Judaism and pandemics, a talk I've wanted to write from scratch. And the way I work is I write my talks up until the moment I give them. And poor Noah, who kept asking me for a talk, and I didn't have anything to give him except scattered notes. So I threw my notes together and sent them to him. But also Chava had asked me for a title literally months before this talk. So I gave her my best guess. And that was, this title, The Community as Patients, Jewish Responses to Pandemics. And as I started to research that, I went down a rabbit hole and began to change what I was actually interested in. So it's not the community as patient that I'm going to talk about. It's rather the community as diseased, and not Jewish responses to pandemics so much as, I've lost my, let me see this. Excuse me 1 second, because my slides all of a sudden are not advancing. And I'm not sure why. Okay. There we go. Sorry, I don't know. It just stopped advancing for a second. And it's not so much Jewish responses to pandemics as it is responses to and by Jews during pandemics historically. So as a social scientist, which is what I'm trained as, I'm really interested in the interaction of pandemics and community. And so I want to start by talking about Jewish epidemics historically. In those communities where Jews lived or were forced to live, primarily in Jewish enclaves, epidemics were events within the Jewish community, also external to it, but the Jewish experience in many places was primarily internal. Jewish physicians treated Jews, not Gentiles in general. Jewish responses were guided by rabbis more than secular authorities within the Jewish enclaves. Their responses to epidemics and how people should behave was often dictated by rabbis in collaboration with doctors. And the management between the Jewish world and the outside world around epidemics were often managed by rabbis, especially around those issues where non-Jews might use that as an opportunity for anti-Jewish action. Of course, today, a lot of Jewish communities do not live in enclaves anymore, though, of course, we still do have them. We're not segregated from the broader community. We're integrated into general healthcare and political institutions. We no longer look solely inward or think our response to epidemics as concerning a closed loop of Jewish doctors, patients, and religious decision makers. We go to secular doctors, largely non-Jewish, and we see ourselves often as citizens following the same guidelines and medical advice as our non-Jewish co-citizens. Of course, there still are Jewish enclaves around the world. Haredi communities in the US, for example, may resemble ancestral communities more than other Jewish groups. And so I want us to start historically and move our way to the present to think about this particular, and I will argue, unique placing. We know that Jews were historically scapegoat during epidemics. The very nature of their cloistered communities often sowed fear and suspicion. And I want to ask how our communities have fared in the changing world. What is new and different? What we have here is a picture of Mount Sinai. It used to be called Jews Hospital, the first Jewish hospital in the United States. And the first Jewish hospital at all was in London in 1844. So it was only shortly before that that the idea of a Jewish hospital was invented. Before that, you did have small Jewish clinics and communities, so to speak. But the Jewish hospital was necessary at the beginning because the Jews had particular needs that hopefully we'll cover as we move forward. But first, I want to say a word about what I'm going to talk about and what it's based on. It's not really based on Susan Sontag's work, but she was the one that really popularized this idea that it's going to be a strain throughout what I discuss, which is that illness as metaphor. And of course, Sontag picked tuberculosis and then later AIDS as her exemplars. But I want to argue that almost all illness is metaphor. And she talked a lot about illness as individual metaphor. And I'm going to be talking about illness as community metaphor. She wrote, and I'm quoting her, "With the modern diseases, once TB, now cancer, the romantic idea that the disease expresses the character is invariably extended to assert that the character causes the disease because it has not expressed itself. Passion moves inward, striking and blighting the deepest cellular recesses." With Jews, it seems to have worked the other way around. Jewish psychological traits are independent of the disease. The disease does not indicate or inculcate these traits, but are seen as an affirmation that those traits existed in the group prior to the disease. With Jews, the disease is not so much regarded as derived from traits, though it is that too, but confirming pre-conceptualized traits in the minds of non-Jews and even Jews, as I'll try to point out. So let's start the historical discussion. I want to argue that throughout Jewish history into today, there are four major narratives or tropes or memes that have characterized conversations around Jewish disease. And these four narratives are the Jews as sickly or diseased. That is, Jewish constitution as being weak and us being susceptible to disease. The second is Jews as either contagious, spreading disease unknowingly, or spreaders of disease, malevolently sowing disease amongst non-Jews. The third, Jews as disease, and I'll explain what I mean by that, not having disease, but as diseases themselves. And then finally, a counter narrative that was always part of this and related to it, and that is Jews as healers. And I'm going to talk about those four elements, all of which are interrelated quite often. They're not distinct. I'll talk about them as distinct, but we should always understand that they're interspersed, interrelated, that sometimes they're held at the same time, even if they're contradictory, and the lines are not clear between these things. So let's begin with the idea of Jews as diseased. I mean, that doesn't need that much elaboration for modern thinkers. The Nazis made that a very clear part of their ideology, Jews as a cancer in the Aryan body. But it started, its history goes long before that. The theological ideas of Jews as sinful conflated with the still theologically based idea of them as diseased. And that transformed, especially in the 19th century, into kind of pseudo-scientific or pseudo-medical model. This is a picture of Jews being burned alive, being having been accused of spreading the plague. During the Renaissance, that image began to change. The Jews had often been called lepers. Leprosy and Jews as lepers was a common sort of metaphor used for Jews as being both diseased and as being something that could spread disease. There were few lepers anymore during the Renaissance. Poisoning people, like poisoning wells, as this shows, was kind of too primitive a claim. So instead, the Jewish body itself became a source of disease. This has been written about a lot in Howard Eilberg Schwartz's book and Sander Gilman's work. Jews were accused of Jewish men menstruated and therefore could contaminate. Jewish communities festered disease. There were certain diseases that were considered to be Jewish diseases. Typhus and Favus were two different public health threats that were considered Jewish disease by not only Gentile physicians, but Jewish physicians themselves. Trachoma was another racialized Jewish infectious disease. In 1792, De La Fontaine wrote about a medical survey he did of Poland. And in that, he looked at the Jewish communities too. And he wrote that the quote unquote filthy environment of the Jews, what they ate, their communality, even their sexual practices were seen to cause a catalog of illnesses ranging from syphilis to conjunctivitis. De La Fontaine's criticism labeled the Jew as more diseased than his contemporary, even though somewhat inscrutably, de Fontaine characterized the Jews as having greater public freedom and security than the average person. Still, despite that, he argues, despite this freedom, they still end up being a sickly people. And of course, the idea that there were specifically Jewish diseases in the 19th and early 20th century in Europe was a factor that transformed from Jewish diseases to Jews as disease that characterized Nazi racial ideology. Then in addition, there is the idea that Jews spread disease, not only that they have it, but that they cause disease in others. A shift from Jews as infected to Jews as infectors. This leper idea that was very much in the public mind is both a model of being diseased and of causing disease. In the early 20th century, typhus spread by lice became an epidemic in Eastern Europe, and I'm going to talk about that a little more in a minute. And it raged across post-revolutionary Russia and Ukraine and Poland before it was really contained in about 1922. It was the chief killer of populations in Eastern Europe and Russia. An estimated 20 to 25 million people became infected with typhus during the Russian Civil War from 1918 to 22. And a minimum of 2.5 to 3 million people died of it during that period. And in Polish lands, as we see from this poster, under occupation, German occupation from 1915 to 1918, German authorities convinced Polish authorities to associate the disease so closely with Jews that in both Polish and German common parlance, typhus became known as Jewish fever. And this poster, Jews are lice, they cause typhus, was a Polish poster posted during that time. So Jews are infected, Jews infect. But this transforms into a kind of deeper idea that's difficult to untangle. I'm going to spend a little more time on it, but I think it's a profound part of even how Jews think of themselves. And that is the idea of Jews as disease, the Jewish body as a innately diseased body, not as one that catches disease, but is intrinsically, by its very nature, innately diseased. Heinrich Heine wrote, "A hospital for poor sick Jews, for people afflicted with threefold misery, with three evil maladies, poverty, physical pain, and Jewishness. The last name is the worst of all three, that 1,000-year-old family complaint, the plague that dragged with them from the Nile Valley, the unhealthy faith from ancient Egypt, incurable, profound suffering. No help can be looked for from steam baths, shower baths, or all the implements of surgery, or all the medicines which this house offers its sick inmates." So for Heine, being Jewish was itself an illness equal to, if not greater than, physical illnesses that we could name. It couldn't be cured through medicine, for it's embedded in the very core of what it means to be Jewish. The idea of the Jew suffering from his or her own Jewishness becomes ironic in that Heine himself later becomes ill, but it reflects Heine's use of the kind of anti-Semitic rhetoric that he absorbed from the greater culture in his characterization of the Jews. He used those tropes from the non-Jewish culture and shaped them to his own ends to criticize Jewish people. From the middle of the 19th century on, physicians became involved in marginalization process of the Jews, validating scientifically their physiological otherness, their innate otherness. Whereas in former times, it was claimed Jews tended to suffer from diseases as a punishment for their sins against Christianity and their lack of belief, now the main prism became racial. It was claimed that Jews in general suffer from various pathologies based on their racial attributes. And these racial attributes had many manifestations, and books like Gilman's The Jewish Body goes through many of them, but they somehow became encaptured and symbolized and encompassed by the idea of the Jewish nose, And we'll see a lot of that as we move forward. But it was claimed that this was an innate part of the Jewish physiology, personality, cultural existence. When one of the most popular novels of the 19th century was Eugene Sue's Le Juif errant. And it's all about the bad guys are all Jesuits. So the Jews aren't portrayed as the sort of protagonist evil people in the novel, but the wandering Jew character in that novel, which popularized this idea of the wandering Jew, embodies disease. Wherever that Jew shows up, there's a cholera epidemic. So there's a fundamental idea that the Jew himself in this novel is the embodiment, the essence of disease, and spreads it almost magically everywhere he goes. And as I say, the nose became a symbol of that pathology. And this was all incorporated in both Jewish and non-Jewish medicine and science. It was believed that the Jewish race was undergoing a process of degeneration, weak nerves, late marriage, low fertility rates, anything they could use as evidence was used that way. And it was a powerful argument for Jews for understanding themselves. Jacob Wasserman around 1926 wrote, "I have known many Jews who have languished with longing for the fair-haired and blue-eyed individual. They knelt before him, burned incense before him, believed his every word. Every blink of his eye was his heroic. And when he spoke of his native soil, when he beat his Aryan breast, they broke into a hysterical shriek of triumph." And notice in that poster from 1916, the pictures of the Jews at the bottom with the characteristic noses. Sandra Gilman in The Jew's Body writes, "The desire for invisibility, the desire to become white, lies at the center of the Jew's flight from his or her own body. The Jew, caught up in Christianity's image of the Jew, has but little choice. His essence, which incorporates the horrors projected on him and which is embodied quite literally in his physical being, must try on one level or another to become invisible." Most Jewish physicians accepted this portrayal of the Jew. They explained it by Jews' harsh historical past and their present difficult living conditions. In the diaspora, the constant wandering, the constant change of place, the lack of rootedness, through the Inquisition, the Middle Age ghettos, the pogroms, the closed life, the enclaves that I talked about, far away from nature as well as far away from centers of civilization, the limitations in the field of economy due to Jews' controlled work and social and political rights. All these Jewish physicians wrote, left traces on the Jewish body and mind, expressed in a weak Jewish physical constitution and a fragile nervous system. This was a very common claim of Jews, of physicians of the time. It was seen not just as something to comment on, but as a significant national social problem. If the Jews were going to liberate themselves from the oppressions of Europe, if they were going to start a new state, then they needed to fix their bodies first. And the result was a call for a Jewish science and a Jewish medicine dedicated to the study specifically of Jewish health issues. They strove to trace the reasons for the Jewish disease and offer a cure, and they began to create strategies for solutions. These are Yiddish posters encouraging better health practices. And the main subjects for these reforms, by the way, was not German Jews or the Jews of the West. It was, of course, Eastern European Jews. And the sort of state of Eastern European Jewry's physical health very much concerned Western European and American Jewish leaders as well as Jewish physicians. In contrast to Western Jews, Eastern European Jews suffered from severe conditions. They had a lot of endemic diseases there. The ideas of reform and philanthropy on the West were often directed at those diseases, but they were loaded with ambivalent feelings because with them came a Jewish perspective that the Jews of Eastern Europe were dirty, foul-smelling, disease-carrying. All the images of the Jew in the anti-Semitic discourse, to some degree or another, got assimilated by the Jews themselves, and some of the desire to cure and help the Eastern European Jews came with that very difficult view of who they were and their fundamental weakness. So there's a paradox in the Jewish science and medicine movement. It had both altruistic and self-serving goals. It was certainly to improve the health of Jews, but it also, by elevating the Eastern European Jews and curing them of their diseases and civilizing them, Western Jews hoped to improve their status in the eyes of the non-Jewish world, to render them worthy of acceptance as equals in the eyes of other people. And so almost all groups of Jews of the time, whether sort of the class struggle Bundish Jews, the religious Jews, the acculturated liberal Jews, the Zionist Jews, all of them promoted this idea of Jewish health, coined very much often in political terms, but really having this undercurrent of a historical belief that the Jews of Europe were fundamentally flawed. And that idea, I think, persists to the modern time. When rhinoplasty first started to become popular in the United States, it was highly overused by Jews. Jews became very well known as customers of rhinoplasty. And you can still see right now, if you, for example, put Jews and rhinoplasty, some of the things that will come up are current cosmetic surgeons' websites where they are encouraging Jews. That's what's there in the lower left-hand corner of the screen I'm showing you. That's a contemporary plastic surgeon's website trying to encourage Jews to get rhinoplasty, because we all know that the Jewish nose is homely. And since I'm from Georgia, and since my son-in-law works for him, I want to remind us what happened in the campaign for John Ossoff, where an advertisement came out by his opponent, which is in the upper right-hand corner of this. On the left is John's real profile. They took that picture and they made his nose bigger. That became an issue here in Georgia, big one, and they had to remove and purge that ad, but it's all part of this persistent sort of view of the Jewish body as ugly or somehow flawed. When I first started working in these areas, in Jewish bioethics early in my career, issues of Jews and genetics became very important. Ashkenazic Jews were being used as research subjects because of our strong founder effect, because we have a much more inbred genome than other groups, because we marry within our own people. We're also a sophisticated, medically aware group. So we were perfect subjects for research. And I attended a meeting in Washington with Francis Collins and Richard Klausner, who was the head of the National Cancer Society, in which I and a group of Jewish leaders said to them, we need to be careful, because if you begin to use Ashkenazic Jews as your exclusive research subjects, and our genetic weaknesses are the first that are identified, we will be discriminated against before other people, simply because you know our weaknesses and you don't know what the Lutherans have because you haven't studied them. And that became an issue. But there was another interesting thing that happened. This was an advertisement. Ann Pulver and her group at Johns Hopkins, a wonderful group, not saying anything negative about them at all. I admire her to a great deal, but this was the first advertisement they came out with to try to recruit Jewish subjects to a schizophrenia study. And it plastered schizophrenia in the Jewish community. Research at Johns Hopkins are looking for these people. And I called her, others did too, and said, that's not an advertisement that is a good one. And we showed her that advertisement was immediately captured and put on the White Aryan Resistance website as evidence that schizophrenia is greater in the Jewish community. So they pulled that ad and they put up this ad. Ashkenazi Jewish families are needed to help scientists understand the biological basis for schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. There was even a little bit of pushback on that one. And then finally, they turned a negative to a positive. Your Jewish ancestry may lead us to a scientific breakthrough. So even there, we see this sensitivity to the way in which Jews are portrayed as part of this problem of the Jewish body. And finally, in almost opposition to these three memes or tropes is, sorry, I forgot this one slide that I wanted to show you. So I am the bioethics advisor to JScreen, the Jewish preconception genetic testing national group. And this was their website from 3 or 4 or 5 years ago. Prevent Jewish genetic diseases with a simple saliva test. And then, if you went to that, or if you go to others, you see something like this, Jewish diseases. And I've encouraged groups not to use that phrase, Jewish genetic diseases, Jewish diseases, as it, because it implies to those who are susceptible to that implication that these are innate problems of the Jewish people. What's interesting is if you go to the JScreen website right now and you look at it, this is what you'll see. Not only doesn't it mention Jewish diseases, it doesn't mention Jews at all. The word Jew isn't even on that, because now genetic testing has become so universal that though they still solicit Jewish groups, and if you go to their FAQ page, it's a lot about I'm Ashkenazi, I'm Sephardi, should I use this? It has become much more generic, and it's taken that Jewish identity off at least its front page. And then finally, almost paradoxically, is the idea of Jews as healers, which is another trope that goes historically through. The Jews, after all, if they carry disease, they should all be sick, but they're selling merchandise in our community, they're having children, their healers must be superior, even magical. In fact, Jewish doctors trained in the Arabic tradition were such good healers that in many places, laws limited their practice to remove competition of Jewish healers with Christian healers. And as we know, some of the Jews were physicians to the most important people in their communities. Moses Haman, physician to Suleiman the Magnificent, was considered one of the greatest, if not the greatest healer in his society. There are many other examples of this. One of the Lusitanus was one of the great figures in medical literature in the first half of the 16th century, a lecturer in the University of Ferrara, and Zacuto was the grandson of the great Abraham Zacuto, who was a renowned astronomer, physician, creator of the astrolabe, which was used all over the world, and inspiration for Vasco da Gama and some belief for Columbus himself. He wrote the extremely popular 12-volume History of Medicine, which was at its time. So these were leaders of their medical community. Rembrandt painted his portrait of Efron Bueno. So the Jewish healer was understood and was celebrated as being some of the greatest healers in the very same society that portrayed the Jewish body as diseased, that portrayed Jews as susceptible to sickness, that portrayed Jews as either unconsciously or intentionally and malevolently spreading disease. So you had this counter trope going on that Jews were also the greatest healer of their day. So I'm going to give you 3 quick examples from history, and then I'm going to conclude by looking at COVID and what's happening today. So we all know about the Black Plague, was accompanied by violence against Jewish communities. In the 14th century, about 40% of the population of Europe died of the Black Death. Jews were often blamed for that. In fact, one study estimated that there were 363 cities with Jewish communities of any size across Europe. And after the plague pandemics, half of those communities were either slaughtered or expelled during plague. There was both, of course, the scapegoating effect that we know so well, the idea of if you have an epidemic, the cause of which you don't know, the effect of which you can't control, a scapegoat removes a lot of the blame from authorities and others. But also, interestingly, Jews' attention was focused on Jews because what Jews actually did became more important during the plague. That is, in the medieval economy, during a plague time, the high-skilled trades such as money lending, trade, and medicine became more valuable in the wake of the plague. And in some places, Jews were also the tax collectors, and tax revenue became more important as so many people died. And in fact, you can see a negative correlation between the importance of Jews in the general economy and the likelihood that they were persecuted during the Black Plague. So levels of Jewish activity and economic integration were actually protective against persecution during the plague. Another aspect of this that studies have shown that's interesting is that during the plague also, persecution was higher in those areas closest to the source of rumor about them. So, or also, by the way, closer to times of Christian holidays. But for example, one center of false rumor was a place called Chillon Castle, located on the shores of Lake Geneva in Switzerland. That's where the Rhine originates. It was a crucial waterway. And one study showed that the closer a Jewish community was to Chillon Castle and to the Rhine River, the more embedded in this sort of rumor, this fake news network, the more likely their community was to be persecuted. And in fact, in those particular communities, the protective effect of high Jewish economic activity was completely absent. So we see that with the plague again, this sort of contradictory Jewish narrative of Jews as intentionally spreading the plague, unintentionally spreading the plague, yet protected because of their economic necessity, the desire to find Jewish healers, all of that completely caught up in this particular example. Or the example of the yellow fever in the 18th century in the United States. It was brutal. It progressed very rapidly. It would take just a week or 10 days from the onset of symptoms to death. Over 10%, I'm from Philadelphia, and if you go to one of our major squares in Philadelphia, there's thousands of people don't realize this when they're there. Thousands of bodies are buried deeply under that square. It was a mass grave for yellow fever. There is a monument there, but people don't look at it. Over 10% of Philadelphia's population died of yellow fever in 1793 alone. And there were useless treatments. A lot of physicians fled the cities, Philadelphia, New York. They fled because they had no treatment and they themselves were susceptible. What's interesting about the yellow fever is it was uniquely tied to the ethical problems of the slave trade and capitalism in general, because the same ships that brought African slaves also brought infected mosquitoes to the Americas and Europe from Africa. And eventually, yellow fever became epidemic in every country that had a major slave trade. In Americas, the disease spread wherever slave trade prospered. And Jews in the 18th century were often enmeshed in that trade that brought enslaved people from Africa. Also, since they were tradesmen, often raw materials were caught up in that as well. Manufactured goods from Europe, which Jews traded in, often could also bring infected mosquitoes. And Christians harped on how yellow fever seemed to follow Jews specter-like around the world. The picture here that I'm showing you is Walter Judah's gravestone in Cherith Israel Cemetery in New York City. It was designed by his brother Benjamin, who bought a flat table stone as opposed to a stand-up stone. Walter Benjamin was a physician. He died at age 20. because he chose to stay and treat patients in New York City rather than flee like many other physicians did. And his brother designed that oval picture carved with 4 motifs that you see there. In the upper right, you can see the picture of the hand of God reaching out of the heavens with an axe to cut down a large tree of life that stretched from the bottom right up into the heavens. Whether that is supposed to indicate Walter's life alone or the life of so many killed in yellow fever is unclear. In the upper left, an angel of death points a flaming sword downward to a cityscape of Manhattan with a row of colonial style houses facing a bay with a ship coming into harbor. These are very Portuguese Jewish motifs for people who died young, but the New York skyline and the flaming sword are new, which suggests that what perhaps his brother was trying to say was that Walter's death by a divine hand on the right parallels the plague that was affecting Manhattan or New York City in general on the left, so that Walter's death was part of a larger, perhaps providential punishment of the entire city rather than just a separate Jewish failing. Perhaps it was an attempt to say it isn't something particular to Jews as the cause or even as the participants in this plague, that it is separate from us, outside of us. And he makes very clear in the text of this tomb that Walter's medical service was, quote, the cause of his death, or as the English puts it, because there's English on there too, he was, quote, worn down by his exertions to alleviate the sufferings of his fellow citizens, and so fell a victim in the cause of humanity. He also points out that he, quote, gave money from his own purse to buy for them beneficent medicines. So there was an attempt in this gravestone to both show the tragedy of yellow fever and to separate the Jews and particularly Walter from it. And then finally, a third example, and this is the
Paul, this is Lisa. I just want to give you a 2-minute warning.
oh, okay.
Okay.
Um,
Or 5 minutes.
yeah, okay. So I'll skip this because it's more of this. I'll skip the example here in Turkey and go instead to Jews and COVID. The Turkish example was very, very similar, where Jews were blamed, and the community at large saw the Jews as infectious and banned them from restaurants and other places. I also do want to say that during the cholera epidemic, which I was going to point out in 1898, Jewish leaders also focused on immigrant marginalized populations within their own groups to single out communities that they thought harbored cholera. And I want to make a parallel with what happened in COVID in just a minute. So let's move to COVID. When COVID hit, it was very much like previous epidemics. We didn't know what caused it. It was endemic to a large population. People were dying. And once again, the Jewish community was targeted. Jewish enclaves, which had operated largely out of the public eye and had developed significant internal organizational structures, like some of the Hasidic Haredi communities in New York, were targeted by public health officials for their activity. Videos of mourners gathered at a funeral of a prominent rabbi appeared on Twitter and Instagram, and they went viral and were treated almost as if the videos themselves were the sources of contagion, as if one small funeral in a small enclave encapsulated the problem of COVID infection for the entire country. And Mayor de Blasio, who's pictured here, wrote a tweet promising mass arrest of any Orthodox Jewish person who violated the city's social distancing regulation. There were many other communities doing the same thing. None of them were threatened with mass arrests anywhere in the country. The only group that was threatened with mass arrest were the Haredi community. Building on this, the echoes of this meme of Jews as a source of contagion, and the government narrative flipped the private-public distinction on its head, and turned this little private gathering into kind of a public example of contagion. As usual, the image of cloistered Jews was targeted, and what was interesting was Jews themselves often criticize the Haredi community for this. You see, once again, that parallel of the sort of more westernized, if we can use that as a metaphor here, Jews thinking of the more cloistered Jews as a source of public infection. But it wasn't just that, it was also the non-Jews attacking the Jews. Anti-Semitic flyers blaming the Jews for COVID were found in at least 8 states. They were part of a coordinated flyer drop by anti-Semitic Goyim Defense League. There's also a Goyim TV. They've adopted that word Goyim as a source of pride to mean non-Jews. And these were found in Alabama, California, Colorado, and many other states. But what's interesting here is, unlike past tropes where Jews were seen as healers, it was exactly those Jews who were healers, as you see in this poster, that were targeted. The Jews that were the head of trying to cure COVID were exactly the ones who were targeted as being the ones who spread COVID. There was a protest in Ohio at the State House where many signs, pro-Trump signs, along with anti-Semitic signs like this one, the real plague, the Jewish rat sign, conspiracies about Soros and others, all part of the upsurge in anti-Semitic attacks in the United States since 2016, all part of that same set of ideas and tropes. The very now quite ubiquitous anti-Semitic happy merchant meme featuring a Jewish man with sort of a heavily stereotyped face and the big nose greedily rubbing his hand together appears over and over and over again in pictures like these that I show you, and one that says, "Get your coronavirus shot." And in the Nation of Islam picked it up too. And all of this was part of how pandemics have the potential to exacerbate long-standing phobias about Jews. In France, you had this poster that's doctors and nurses and other healthcare professionals on the right, and the Rothschild fat Jew with the money, the dollar and euro sign, showing that's really where Jews are using the coronavirus as a tool to gain control and power, so that they can come up with a remedy and then charge for it. And also because they're generally evil. What did Jesus say about the elves? "I know thy works and tribulation and poverty, but thou art rich. And I know the blasphemy of them which say they are elves and are not, but are from the workshops of Satan." And just in case you don't know who they're talking about, there once again is that same meme of the evil Jewish merchant. If you had, and not only that, but let's give it to Jews. If you have the bug, give a hug, spread the flu to every Jew, Holocaust. So I could show you more of these, but I want to now just end with a conclusion. And that is 2 quick things, and I'm done. One, I feel a little guilty giving this talk. I really do believe that Jewish overemphasis on anti-Semitism, on the violence against us, on the idea of the Jews as a disease meme, doesn't always serve us that well. Prompt those who don't know that much about Jews or Jewish history to think that that is the main and important story of the Jewish people. And Google says that why are Jews hated is one of the most common inquiries about Jews on Google. So to some degree, that the focus on the Haredi Jews, I mean, all of these things only serve to cement our impression of otherness as it is. So let's end on a slightly more optimistic and happy note, it was Jews that in Jewish ideas, to a large degree, certainly not exclusively, that were involved in finding cures to COVID. Jews have been active in every aspect, from, like the anti-Semitic poster says, from policy to pharmaceuticals to clinical care to public care, even to the bioethics community who wrote policies for triage and ventilator allocation. Jews have played a large role in that, like they have in the place. It's true that Jews hold a special place in the public imagination around disease. It's partially because we do have a special role to play around disease. And it's also true because our Jewish belief system, our values, make it imperative that despite these negative stories and negative tropes, that we have an obligation to heal. Thanks.
Thank you, Paul. You can stop sharing the screen. I have a response that, but time is relatively short. I will try to cut it down as we go, and stop in time for questions. So thank you, Paul. Professor Wolpe has shown us how people make sense of pandemics, like we make sense of everything else, in terms of what we already believe to be true, and using the categories through which we already see the world after centuries of seeing Jews as carriers of disease, as a disease itself, as spreaders of disease, and as having an oversized role for better and for worse in managing and treating disease. It should be no surprise when a worldwide pandemic breaks out, killing millions and keeping billions home from work for a time, and closing schools and grinding governments to a halt, and so much more, that these traditional notions of Jews and disease would be, for some, for many, among the fundamental, almost a priori categories that many people bring when they seek to understand a new contagion. So as a further demonstration of the power of some of these pre-existing notions and the hold that they can have on us and the way that they can structure what is going on around us, I would like now for a few minutes to look at some of the ways in which, and this is a direct continuation to what you were describing towards the end, Paul, of the attitudes towards ultra-Orthodox in America. I would like to look for a moment at some of the ways in which the ultra-Orthodox Jews in Israel, Haredim, have been regarded during the pandemic by Jews, of course, and to see how many of the traditional preconceptions that Professor Wolpe described have turned up in this case too. So a year ago this week, Israel held elections, the third round of elections in a little more than a year. And a year ago next week, the heads of each of the parties that won representation in the Knesset had an audience with then President Ruvi Rivlin to tell him whom he should choose to form the new government and presumably to stand at its head as prime minister. And when Rivlin met with representatives of an ultra-Orthodox party called the Torah Judaism Party, one second. Its party head, Moshe Gafni, who spoke, and when he did, it was impossible to miss how deeply upset he was. So he said, we have had a hard year, and by we, I mean the entire world and the country had a hard year, but we, the ultra-Orthodox public, the Haredi public, many times over, there were many violations of the corona regulations of the Ministry of Health in every circle, in every place, but the focus of the camera was always on the ultra-Orthodox. It became clear to us what we have always anyway known, that there is a group, and it's not a small one, in Israeli society that hates the Haredi public and does everything it can to find every opportunity to slander it. For us, this was something that hurt us very, very much. That the insults that Gafni talked about, sometimes at the edge of tears, sometimes you could literally in the video see tears rolling down his face. It was real. The campaigns that had led up to the election included for no fewer than 5 parties, a platform of criticism of the ultra-Orthodox as their major plank in their platform, and the role the ultra-Orthodox played in the spread of COVID-19 and the need to disempower the ultra-Orthodox and to discipline them because they are literally killing us. So we have in Avigdor Lieberman's right-wing Yisrael Beitenu party, the slogan was an end to the rule of the ultra-Orthodox. Meretz has had signs saying they will not decide, you can only count on Meretz. There were posters that said they have blood on their hands with ultra-Orthodox leaders. The ultra-Orthodox are a danger to public health. That's what that sign reads. And of course, as is often the case with politicians, the politicians were responding to popular sentiments that they did not create. And that could be seen in many places and very vividly in the press, in papers, and on TV. For example, just before the election, at the height of the 3rd COVID surge and the 3rd COVID lockdown, a scholar of religion and religious radicalism in Israel named Sarah Hirschhorn wrote this in Haaretz, Israel's paper of record. She wrote, "Let us imagine in a Middle Eastern land far away, a man straps a bomb-rigged vest to his chest. He wanders into a seminary where young men are gathered learning from the holy books, or he enters into a house of worship where row upon row of men are praying devoutly. He might stop by a market, board a bus, or even mingle in the crowd of a wedding or a funeral. He closes his eyes and cries, 'God is great.' The explosives detonate." This is what is happening every day across cities in Israel, except that the man is wearing a vest with ritual fringes, a black suit and hat, and the incendiary device is a cloud of invisible droplets laden with COVID-19. And this imagery is powerful. And if you parse it, you see at least part of the picture of how ultra-Orthodox came to be seen in Israel in a time of pandemic. For one thing, they're taken to be extremists, unafraid of death, like other true believers, like Taliban members or Al-Qaeda. Another thing is that the ultra-Orthodox are seen as being eager to incite a civil war. Another is that the ultra-Orthodox are heedless of the needs of other Israelis or even the lives of other Israelis. They're indifferent to the suffering of others. They are willing to visit disease and death on the country to protect their primitive beliefs and their undue power. And this picture was reflected everywhere. Here's a political cartoon with an ultra-Orthodox man bringing in suitcases of COVID into Israel. Here you have, at the microscope, when it enlarges COVID, you see that it's just the ultra-Orthodox who are at COVID. Graffiti on a wall near my house, Lo Etzlenu, not by us. Other graffiti, Haridim achutza, Haridim out, you filthy people. It is a dim and disparaging picture. Now, to understand where this poor view of the ultra-Orthodox in the pandemic came from, then you have to understand a few epidemiological facts and a few social and political facts. Two fundamental epidemiological facts is that Haridim, ultra-Orthodox, had for the first year of the pandemic at least much higher infection rates than the general population of Israel. And Haridim also died at higher rates than the rest of us did, as you see from this. It's also true that that per capita, fewer of the sick ultra-Orthodox died than the rest of us because the ultra-Orthodox have 3 times as many children as non-ultra-Orthodox Israelis. Those are the basic epidemiological facts of the case. The basic socio-political facts were first that there were ostentatious, very widely reported examples of ultra-Orthodox ignoring coronavirus regulations in super spreaderish ways. This is a funeral of a prominent rabbi at the height of the pandemic. And this picture was everywhere on social media and on the TV and in the news. There were also several prominent weddings of the children of prestigious rabbis that also gathered people where the rest of us were not having big weddings. And ultra-Orthodox broke the padlocks that the government put on their synagogues and insisted on praying. And the most important thing was what happened in the schools, where ultra-Orthodox leaders like Harav Chaim Kanievsky, Zichrono Livracha, who passed away just last week, issued a decree saying that he would not agree to closing the schools despite a government order that called for all schools to close and go to Zoom. He wrote, "Since the days of our forefathers, we have never stopped learning, and the world exists only by virtue of the students who study, and they are our great security, and that we will not be visited by destruction." Closing the schools, Kanievsky argued, would invite death. It wouldn't save us from death. It is also true that the Minister of Health for the first months of the pandemic was himself an ultra-Orthodox man who became a lightning rod for complaints. And after he himself came down with the virus, with COVID-19, after he illegally prayed in an illegal speakeasy synagogue against the rules established by the ministry that he himself headed, he was widely held to be a hypocrite and symbolic of all the ultra-Orthodox hypocrisies. And so together these things led to a view almost universally held by non-ultra-Orthodox Israelis that the pandemic had unmasked something about the ultra-Orthodox, that we could now see that they were an extremist death cult engaged in civil war, heedless of the needs of other Israelis, uncaring about our health and indeed about our lives, with outsized and ridiculous faith in divine providence, and outside and ridiculous suspicion of science and scientists, medicine and doctors, which made them a terrible threat to the very lives of all the rest of us. That was the prevailing analysis, but, and this is the point, that prevailing analysis did not take into account or give proper weight to other important facts. It missed things. For instance, in general, the high infection rates among ultra-Orthodox were universally attributed to things that the ultra-Orthodox did or refused to do out of choice. They chose to go to massive funerals when no one else was going to funerals. They chose to hold big weddings. They chose to send their kids into crowded classrooms. And then the kids went from the classrooms to the homes that they shared with their grandparents, who then died. All of this against government orders. But what we did not look at was the fact that most of the sickness and death among the ultra-Orthodox was a product of things that were not a result of choices that the ultra-Orthodox made. Things like population density, the fact that the ultra-Orthodox live in 2.5 times as dense circumstances as the rest of us. There are 2.5 times as many ultra-Orthodox per room in an apartment as there are the rest of us. This fact alone, the way in which ultra-Orthodox life is packed in the densest cities in Israel and some of the densest cities in the world, that is enough to explain the higher rates of infection that they experienced. And it also explained the strong pattern that emerged of infections within families who just did not have rooms to self-isolate like the rest. When one family member became sick, like my wife did, or my daughter did, or my son did, or I did, each of us in our turn, when we became sick, because we live in an apartment where we have 2 rooms for every person and not 7 rooms for seven people for every 1 room. Population density also explains why ultra-Orthodox kids could not study at home like the rest of the country's children, where there are almost no ultra-Orthodox homes that have desks and workplaces for all the children who live there. And they also, for both ideological and economic reasons, do not have computers in their homes, making distance learning impossible. To these things, one must add other important aspects of ultra-Orthodox life in Israel. The fact, for instance, that ultra-Orthodox life is highly communal, with lots of mutual aid and shared services, some of them informal, like from community pantries to shared childcare to shared laundry, and much more, meaning that for many households, meeting the most basic human needs, getting food to the table and clothes on your kid's back, takes a great deal more of close human contact that promotes the transmission of a virus then most of the rest of us need to get our basic human needs met in the way that we meet them. It is also true that ultra-Orthodox life is organized around both highly local and at the same time, highly global networks. Different Hasidic courts and religious and ideological streams have centers in a number of Israeli cities, Jerusalem, Bnei Brak, Modi'in Eilit, Elad, and more, but also in a number of European cities, in Antwerp and London and Paris, and also in American cities, in New York and Los Angeles, also in Buenos Aires. Travel between these places is constant and intense. As anyone who has ever been on a plane between Israel and New York or Israel and anywhere, you notice that half the plane is ultra-Orthodox because their life is built around traveling between these centers. And these are just a few of many factors that account for why the coronavirus affected ultra-Orthodox Israelis differently than other Israelis. But this few is already enough to see that any good assessment of why the ultra-Orthodox in Israel responded to the pandemic in the ways that they did, and why they fell ill at the high rates that they did in the pandemic, would not arrive at the explanations that most of us reached, that the ultra-Orthodox are selfish, tribal, death-wishing, science-defying primitives, which leads to the question, in conclusion, is why the gap? Why the gap between what a sober assessment would tell us about population densities and age distributions and access to technology and about poverty, between those things and the strongly held, often repeated explanation that we came to as events occurred and that we hold to this day, that the ultra-Orthodox fell sick and made the rest of us sick because they are heedless and selfish and benighted. Why the gap? And here is where one of the things that we just learned this morning from Professor Wolpe is so very important for understanding attitudes towards Jews and pandemic, and not just Jews. For as Professor Wolpe has shown us, sometimes, often, the conclusion that we ostensibly draw from a pandemic about its victims are in fact the very ideas that we had before the very first pathogen ever spread from one person to the next. The idea that Haredim compromise, that the idea that Haredim comprise a state within a state and they feel no obligation to follow the country's laws when these laws don't serve their own selfish, narrow interests. This is an idea that has been around for years and invoked in Israeli debates about, for instance, whether ultra-Orthodox yeshiva students need to be exempted from army service, mandatory army service, so that they can do what they want, which is study Torah. The idea that the ultra-Orthodox care less about human life, including their own, than the rest of us, is an idea that for years has been talked about in Israeli public debate to explain why so many ultra-Orthodox choose to spend their lives learning rather than earning, rather than working, essentially choosing poverty and all the troubles that poor health and poverty bring. These answers, then, the answers we found, that Haredim are a self-serving state within a state who have no respect for life, existed before the questions ever did. The questions of why did Haredim act the way they did during the pandemic, and why did the pandemic harm ultra-Orthodox more than it did the rest of us, and how did ultra-Orthodox become a vector harming the rest of us. So one reason for the gap between our explanation of Haredim in the pandemic and the reality of the ultra-Orthodox in the pandemic is that our explanations existed before the reality they purport to explain. And another reason for the gap is that these explanations do work, especially political work. For one thing, they offer a ready explanation for Israel's up and down performance in addressing the pandemic, especially before the arrival of vaccines. So for politicians eager to divert the anger and frustration and blame of citizens forced out of work, or parents who couldn't send their kids to school, or daughters and sons worried sick about not even being able to visit their own aging parents, it was useful, it is useful to be able to say the problem is the ultra-Orthodox. They are the petri dish for the virus, and they are the vector. They fuel the pandemic, and they do this willingly, knowingly, heedlessly. It is very useful for a politician serving during a pandemic to be able to say, it is not me, it is them. And there is another reason for the gap between how we understand what the ultra-Orthodox said and did during the pandemic and the reality. And that is that there are certain parts of the religious experience of ultra-Orthodox Jews that are deeply misunderstood by most of us who are not part of that religious community. And they include practical parts of the religious experience of ultra-Orthodox Jews, like what I mentioned, the transnational and networked nature of their communal life and the profound ways in which the lives of communities in Jerusalem and New York and Antwerp and Buenos Aires are connected, and the profound interpenetration of community institutions and domestic life. They do not live their lives in nuclear apartments the way that I live my life. And also the impact of living in multi-generational families and living with so many souls in a tiny, small apartment in very crowded buildings on very crowded streets and very crowded neighborhoods. So with relentless cruelty, as I do not need to tell you, here as and elsewhere, the pandemic took lives and it destroyed families, it wrecked businesses, it weakened communities, it derailed careers and lots more. With the same relentless cruelty, the pandemic also brought to light a great many notions that we have of the other, fears and misconceptions, in this case of the ultra-Orthodox. As we learned from Professor Wolpe, this has been true for Jews throughout history and today, just as it is true in different ways for LGBTQ folks during an AIDS epidemic, and it's true for people who weigh more than what the charts say they ought to during an obesity epidemic, because as Professor Wolpe showed so beautifully, health and sickness, contagion and pandemic, though we describe them in languages of biology and medicine and statistics, they are always also very human affairs with all the wonders and weaknesses that always come with very human affairs. Thank you. Now we will open for questions.
We only have time for one question. I suggest that, Paul, and you look at this question from Sandra Gilman, who has done a lot of work related to, okay, so look at the question, and if you can respond to it, we will have to start the next session at 10:30, so we have about 3 minutes.
So I had already looked at that question, and of course, Sandra's work is seminal in anybody talking about anything in this topic. The fact that there were greater deaths in those communities, and the fact that those communities did often, their leadership did often, the infection in those communities was not only because of the factors that Noah said, living in close quarters and things like that, but also because very often their spokesman explicitly denied the factual basis of some of the things that were found in public health and all that. All of that's true. My point is not that those communities don't deserve some criticism for the way they handled it. I think they do. My point was rather that public officials targeted those communities when those same activities were happening in communities throughout the United States. No, there was no other case where the mayor of a city threatened to arrest people of a particular sub-community. I mean, they often threaten to arrest people, broadly speaking, who didn't wear masks or things like that. But no other community was targeted the way the Haredi community in New York was targeted by Mayor de Blasio as a singularly guilty community. So while I agree, Sandra, with your point, and I think that there's legitimate criticism to be made against the Haredi communities that I don't think behaved as well as they should have during COVID. My concern was less about that. That's something that we can do, than about the question of why, given that, why were they targeted in a political and public way that no other community was?
And I would just add, I mean, the issue of when you write about what happens when those who have been stereotypically blamed for the spread of disease are actually responsible for this. I know that you know this better than anyone, but responsibility is an extremely complex thing. And I think that we have that in the heat of these discussions on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean, that we simplified the notion of responsibility, and it was too easy to say that these communities were the authors of their own miseries, when in fact the real state of affairs was much, much more complicated than that.
All right, I think we're going to bring it to a close here. You can see the complexity of the issues, and we can do another hour just conversation about those two wonderful presentations.